Welcome to Beyond Perception, where it's all about discovering truth beyond our limited perception and waking up to our human nature, our true self, and to our connectedness with all life. My name is Simon, and my guest today is Dr. Linda Elder. She's an educational psychologist and a prominent authority on critical thinking. She is the president of the Foundation for Critical Thinking and executive director of the Center for Critical Thinking, the longest running institution on critical thinking in the world. Founded more than 40 years ago, it advances the highest level of scholarship in critical thinking and is one of the rare few independent think tanks of scholars fostering critical thinking internationally. You're also the author of multiple books about critical thinking. And as far as I know, so please correct me if that's wrong, your goal is to advance fair-minded critical thinking in society, at work, and in all domains of human life. So welcome, Dr. Elder. It's a true pleasure to speak to you today.
Thank you for having me. And yes, you're correct. That is our primary goal. Our primary goal at the Foundation and Center for Critical Thinking have always been to advance fair-minded critical thinking across human societies. And we've done that fundamentally through the schools, but we also work with business, government, military, individuals, homeschool parents. Our approach is authorized for use in the United States military, in the Army Field Manual. And what this means is if you're teaching critical thinking at the college level in the military, you must use our approach to critical thinking. So we have the longest running history as an organization on critical thinking in the world, as you have pointed out. And we are entering our 42nd year. And our organization was founded by the late Dr. Richard Paul in 1980. And he died in 2015, and we continue his work. So we're basically an intellectual think tank of scholars who develop written materials, books, thinkers' guides, to critical thinking in multiple areas for anyone interested in advancing their own thinking.
That's awesome. And I want to just briefly provide context how I found you. I myself, I'm 38 years old now, and just last year I realized I never learned to think, and that much of my own thinking didn't really add up to a lot of sense. It was either egocentric or self-sabotaging, keeping me basically in a perception of how reality is or how I should be, instead of really exploring outside my identity what the actual truth about things, about reality, about myself is. And I recognized I mainly was educated in what to think, and this is the truth, this is right, this is wrong. So kind of repeating thoughts, but I wasn't taught how to think and how to find truth myself. And I also realized that this lack of own judgment or own thinking capacity really prevented me from experiencing freedom and my own self-empowerment. And this realization led to actually starting this podcast, and it's called Beyond Perception for a reason. And then also to find you at the Foundation for Critical Thinking. And now I'm learning, I'm studying, I'm taking classes with you about critical thinking. And I have the feeling that some of the listeners don't really have context about what is critical thinking or what does it mean. Would you mind sharing your perspective on that?
Sure. First of all, there's a lot in what you said, and it's very important. Your story is very important because it's a story that many others could tell. That is, they at some point realized they really knew nothing of critical thinking, and that then shocked them, and then they began on a path, and the paths, there are better and worse paths toward criticality. And so we're not, in human societies, critical thinking, fair-minded critical thinking is really not valued. And it's not valued first because it's not understood. You can't value something that you don't understand. So, and for this very reason, you're asking for a definition of critical thinking. So here we are in the year 2021, and we're still asking for a definition of critical thinking. That says something. And this conception of critical thinking that we advance has grown up over the last couple of, let's say, the last 2,400 years, beginning with Socrates. And of course, Socrates comes on the heels of other thinkers, and he begins to put things together in ways and articulate them in ways that make our access to thinking become a little more clear. And what Socrates did then is he said, look, we're learning a lot about the earth, and that's fine. And we want to do math, and that's fine too. But what we really need to do is focus on the human mind, because that's where our problems lie. And we've also got to bring in, and I'm thinking, I was using my words for Socrates thinking, we've also got to bring in the ethical dimension. We have to do what's right. And we had to discipline our thinking, and we have to do what's right. And this is where the concept of critical thinking, I think can be most definitively traced back to as an original point. And there are going to be lots of other historical references to criticality coming before Socrates as well. So human beings have always thought critically to some degree. And all of us think critically to some degree. And we think better. Most of us think better. All of us think better in one or more domains of our lives over other domains. So you can't be at an A++ level thinker in every single domain of human thought. It's an impossibility. Mm-hmm. Therefore, we're all imperfect because for one thing, we just lack knowledge in many fields. But we are constantly reasoning, or we are routinely reasoning throughout human life. And we have developed tools for criticality, for thinking critically as we go about living our lives. And lots of people have thought critically, as I've said, in history, and we can look at their work and we can study their work and we can see how it is critical in orientation, because we have intellectual standards for doing that. Now, let me zoom forward to the 1970s, 1980s. It's in this era that we begin to get a blossoming of the theory of critical thinking, and we begin to see the term critical thinking come into use really more in the 1990s and on into really maybe only to about 10 years ago. About 10 years ago, we started to see it permeating into society so that the quote person on the street has heard of the term critical thinking now. But then if you ask anyone, academicians included, for a definition of critical thinking, you will be doing an interesting experiment. First ask them this: do you believe that you think critically? And when they say yes, then, and some extremely humble people will say, well, I'm not really sure, I don't know. But so mostly people say, well, I hope so, or yes, I am. Then you say, well, how would you define critical thinking? Then you'll get a big blank. You'll get a big pause. You get an ambiguous answer. You'll get a partial answer, which may be well and good, but not the total answer, but presented as total. So we begin to get in the last decade more use of the critical thinking. So critical thinking the term is gaining in use, but I would say it's not gaining in currency yet, because we're not taking it seriously yet. So in this era of the 70s and 80s, Richard Paul and other theoreticians were coming from mainly the field of philosophy, but some other fields as well, and they were beginning to define critical thinking and to really capture critical thinking, although there are references before this point. And in the decades that follow, then, and the decade or so before that, Richard Paul was asking certain kinds of questions like, well, we talk about reasoning and we know that we reason, and philosophy has a definition for reasoning, and it often uses things like formal logic, which aren't really very helpful for the human living on the street, the regular people, which was always his concern. So you've got all these different ways of thinking about reasoning. And so the question for Richard was, but what is really entailed in reasoning, though? We've got philosophers say you have the premises and you have the conclusions. Okay, so then, but is that all there is? Is that all we have in reasoning? Because I pick up this other book and it talks about purpose in reasoning. And I pick up this other book and it talks, I'm just thinking aloud for Richard. You see, he was at this point, and this is happening in the 1960s, his dissertation, Richard Paul's dissertation, 1960s. So he's beginning to ask these questions, as I said, along with other theoreticians. And over time, he developed the theory of critical thinking, which I will now briefly explain. And then we have continued to carry forward what I call the Paulian school of critical thinking. And as you mentioned, in the beginning, Simon, the ethical dimension is at the front and center of our work, because many people will give a definition of critical thinking that lacks the ethical dimension. And we say then that's a failure in critical thinking. The ethical dimension is implied or it's not implied in the circumstances. You don't get to decide whether you consider someone else's point of view. The question at issue determines that. These are things that Richard's, beginning to pull together. And so then let me just give you an overview of the main tools in our approach to critical thinking. This is the Foundation for Critical Thinking approach. It's also referred to as the Paul Elder Framework for Critical Thinking. And we don't care what it's called. We just want people to actually learn it. And we want people, we don't really want it to be called anything except critical thinking, because that's how we envision critical thinking in this way. So basically what Richard came to is this: let's boil it down to the most fundamental concepts that will help everyone think better at every level. That was always Richard's concern. So we've got to take this out of the classroom. We've got to get it into real life. And by the way, that was also one of Socrates' main points. It's no use if just philosophers are sitting around talking about something. The question is, are we using the concepts that they think that they're giving us, that they think are important, to live what Socrates called the examined life? So what Richard came to is basically these three sets of tools, and in connection with the barriers to critical thinking, which I'll mention as we go along here. So the basic idea is that we can pull together from our natural languages intellectual standards, what he called universal intellectual standards, such as clarity, accuracy, relevance, logicalness, breadth, depth, precision, significance, completeness, fairness, and there are many, many others, or hundreds or thousands or more intellectual standards implicit in natural languages. And if you stretch it further, we find many, many concepts that imply standards in natural languages. So that it's like almost like that it's an unlimited set of connections that could be made here. In other words, humans have always used intellectual standards to reason well. Some people are very good at clarifying. They may not know that they are. I mean, they don't know necessarily have these explicit tools that they're using because they're doing it intuitively. But what we argue is that that's really not good enough, though, because even though you're maybe reasoning well intuitively within one domain of your life, maybe you're an excellent engineer, but maybe then you come home and you're abusive to your family. So then you could say, well, at work, I'm clear, accurate, relevant, broad, deep. Broad meaning considering multiple viewpoints. I'm fair, I get along, everyone thinks I'm wonderful. But then I come home and I like turn into another person. So that's problematic. And that's a person that's actually at minimum a hypocrite and possibly a psychopath. Because if you're completely different at home than you are at work, what does that say of you? Who are you? And that relates to the bottom rectangle here of intellectual traits. Our ultimate goal is to embody these intellectual traits.
So you could even say that there is almost a self-realizing spiritual dimension to critical thinking about being the best human you could possibly be by developing
that is the ultimate goal, and that ultimate goal connects with what we used to call or could call self-actualization. Mm-hmm. It's, you see, and this is directly related to any kind of effective therapeutic technique, because we need to be embodying intellectual. Let me just talk now about intellectual traits. Sure. I went from the bottom. I can actually enter these concepts at any one of these 3 points. So I don't need to say the standards, the elements, the traits. I can move around. So if you understand something of the standards, you know, see how simple that is, right? How easy this is. I often say critical thinking is so easy, it's hard. Because people say, of course you need to be clear. Of course you need to be accurate. Of course you need to keep your thinking relevant. And I can say, well, then watch yourself this week and tell me how often you violate those 3 standards. And if you're violating them, then yes, you know them theoretically, but that doesn't mean you've internalized them as tools. So we have intellectual standards, and our ultimate goal that we apply to thinking to make sure that it is of high quality. And if we do that routinely, we're going to be thinking critically at a high level. But our ultimate goal is the development of intellectual character. And this can be viewed here in a slightly different way. Mm-hmm. And I'm in the community online right now. I'll show you in a few minutes. We have a community online, criticalthinkingcommunity.org, and this is a subscription community. You can join us. We have free webinars there, and these diagrams I'm showing you are there in the community. So this diagram shows the intellectual virtues that were before in a list in more of a constellation, and realize that there are also more intellectual virtues in these, just like there are more intellectual standards. But these are starting places. These are elementary. These are foundational. And if we embody these intellectual virtues, we'll also embody other intellectual virtues, such as intellectual discipline, intellectual responsibility, intellectual curiosity. These are interrelated. And so let me just talk a little about this. So the idea is that we've got, and this is also going back to Socrates, that we're trying to develop as certain types of people that are living at the highest level of insight and understanding and self-fulfillment, as well, while also contributing to the advancement of actual culture and actual inclusion, and a world where we're actually not prejudiced and biased, in like every direction. So in other words, if you think about all of the problems that humans face, They face them mainly because they're not using intellectual standards well, and they're not aspiring to intellectual virtues. And they're largely not aspiring to them because they don't know they exist. They don't know how to develop the executive function of the mind, right? The mind over mind that defines in a way critical thinking. So you could say critical thinking, Richard used to say, is thinking about your thinking while you're thinking in order to improve your thinking. So mostly we think and we act. Where is that where's that executive level? That's the critical thinking dimension that has to be developed. We're not given that. Now, some of us, it's easier for some of us to learn it than others, but it's available, in my view, to every human who can reason at some level. So now, let me talk just a little about the intellectual virtues. So remember, I said that this comes from a much larger set, but here's just brief, some brief definitions. So intellectual humility means that if I'm embodying this, if I'm embodying intellectual humility, and nobody does this perfectly because no one's perfect, but if I'm embodying this at a high level, then at any given moment, no matter who I'm with or what I'm doing, I can easily distinguish the line between what I know and what I do not know. And I'm perfectly comfortable with that line moving. I don't need to know more than I don't need to know more than I do know. If I do need to know it, I will find it out. If I don't know it, I will say I do not know. And as you know, the best scholars will often say, we don't know the answer to that. They're very comfortable with that. I misspoke when I said that because I wasn't aware of this other research. And now I've completely changed my position. So these are examples of intellectual humility. Intellectual integrity, we were just talking about, a person who is consistent across the domains of her life. And so that let's say that you and I are in weekly meetings together and online, and then you come and visit me at my house. Well, you would expect me to be the same at home. And you saw me around my children. My behavior around my children should be implied by what you already know about me. So if you come to my house and suddenly I'm a totally different person, then you can ask, well, who is Linda then? Because you can't say, well, she just does that when she's at home. What? That means you fail. If you fail at home, you fail. Because those are the people that you're the closest to, that you have the most influence on over, and the ones that you can most harm. So I never sort of said it like that, and maybe even thought of it like that. But you see, so a person of integrity is a person who has intellectual integrity is a person who is thinking the same within all domains of human life, and is a person who expects more, or at least as much, of herself as she does of other people. So in other words, I'm not going to say, well, you have to be accurate, but I don't. Right? I don't have to adhere to anything, but you do. Now that's another example of lacking in intellectual integrity. Intellectual autonomy is very important because it means I'm willing to stand alone in my beliefs as long as I'm thinking critically. It doesn't just mean standing alone and saying, well, I just want to be different now. And I'm going to, just take off my clothes and run down the road nude just to be different. Well, maybe if I'm making a revolutionary point, that's one thing. But if I'm just trying to be different, then that's another. That's not intellectual autonomy. Intellectual autonomy means you're thinking at the best level that you can within a situation or a context, and you are willing to stand completely alone against the crowd, and you don't mind it. You're totally comfortable with that. And the best thinkers are able to do that because they often do stand alone in their beliefs. You're not standing entirely alone, but it feels like it because the people that are connecting with you may be in Switzerland. They may not be in your, they may not be your next door neighbor. They probably aren't your next door neighbor. So intellectual, but you see, the reason why this one is so important is because people tend to need to be validated by other people. And this leads to all manner of sociocentric thinking, group think, selfish group thinking, which is what I call groupishness, being locked into a group's viewpoint. And if you think about it logically, if you understand the concept of logic, then you know that logically speaking, you can find almost anybody to agree with you. If you just need someone to agree with you, you can find a group that will agree with you. That's easy. So then when you get validated by those people, then you think you're right. But it's true because we believe it is not an intellectual standard. It's a standard in common use, but it's not an intellectual standard. So it's very hard for people to have intellectual autonomy because, for one thing, we have this nature toward one another that we need one another. We need to be around our species. That's normal. And if you're not engaging with your species, you're probably not emotionally well, because we just seem to need that. So then the question is, how do we get that in a healthy way? And sometimes you can't. Sometimes you are actually alone. And in that case, you have to figure out how to stay mentally well without human connection. And now I haven't even brought in animals here, but they're also relevant because our behavior impacts them. And to the degree that our behavior impacts sentient creatures, we have an ethical responsibility to consider their viewpoints. That's built in to the context. It's not a choice that we get to make. So intellectual autonomy means I can stand alone in my beliefs. I'm perfectly comfortable with that. I don't need anyone to agree with me. And if everyone does agree with me, I'm just still going to question. Just because everyone's agreeing does not mean that it's right. So I'm going to go with the evidence. And now that's related to confidence and reason. Confidence and reason means we're going to follow the evidence wherever it takes us, no matter what. And that means that we're all right with learning things about ourselves that we don't like. It's all right to face that you're a know-it-all and you always have been. You're a person that people can't stand because you always have the right answer. But that doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It means you need to face your weaknesses. Yes, you've been this way all of your life. That doesn't mean you can't change. So this is where critical thinking comes in, because critical thinking is based on the premise that we have almost an unlimited capacity to develop. And so here we have some of the intellectual virtues. Confidence and reason, again, means we're going to follow the evidence. We're not going to leave anything relevant out. We're not going to decide what information is relevant. We're going to just follow it. It hurts, but I'm still going to follow it. I may have to change my position. Before I was a conservative, now I'm a liberal. Before I was a liberal, now I don't like what the liberals are saying because I don't agree with that. So I'm going to have to go it alone now. You see, you got to make these moves. Intellectual empathy means we can enter other viewpoints, especially those with which we disagree. We can speak from the voice of another person. We can throw our minds into another person. And we can do this often with reading. We can read the works of great authors. We can think within their thoughts. That will help us develop. Intellectual courage means we have the courage to look at our own beliefs. The courage to examine your beliefs, the courage to ask yourself questions about your religious beliefs, the way you think about sexuality, the way you think about parenting, the way you think as a citizen, and so forth. So the courage to face what stop running from yourself. That's one thing I don't want to know about myself. So I'm just going to slam that door. That's the opposite of intellectual courage. And so ultimate and intellectual perseverance means we're willing to work through complexities and issues until we get to the best solution, the best answers that hopefully solve the problem. And this is, again, a great failure in human life because we're not good at intellectual perseverance. We can't, we often can't reason as it were beyond the end of your nose. And so we're not good at thinking, well, if I do this, this might happen, and then that might happen. One of these three things might happen. And then, so think about the Afghanistan is a perfect example of this. When the United States went into Afghanistan, you have to say, what were we doing there? What did we know about the culture there? What did we know about the people there? What did we think we were doing? What did we actually do? Did we even think about what we were doing? Did we think about what's going to happen when we leave this place and all these things that we brought in are going to be then lifted? Are we going to be able to build the alliances that are needed assuming we had good intent? And the United States does not have a good record in this regard. So historically, then when we leave, just colossal failures in critical thinking, one after another. And so what? So why bother? Well, the so what is people are dead. That's the so what. Those are the implications of poor thinking in Afghanistan. Now people are dead. They're fearing for their lives. They're scrambling to get out. They were promised, and they were ditched because of failures in thinking. Didn't do primary goal. And let me just then come back to the overview here. So we have intellectual standards. We need to learn these. We need to apply them routinely. And this is not something that we do from a 1 hour discussion. It's a beginning place. We have intellectual traits, virtues, character that we're trying to develop in ourselves. These are markers for us to work toward. And then we can open up our reasoning by focusing on the elements of reasoning. And this circle shows the elements of reasoning embedded in our reasoning whenever we reason. Now, where the standards are much more expansive and the virtues are more expansive, elements are self-contained. In other words, what Richard did over a couple of decades is he narrowed reasoning down to this. He said, whenever you reason, you have a purpose, you're asking questions, you use information, you make inferences. This is coming from your concepts, connected to your assumptions, also entrenched in your point of view. And all of this leads to implications and in real life consequences when you act upon your reasoning. And the brilliance here is that what you see, what's very important is that where you have one of the elements, all the other elements are present. So right now in this interview, Simon, you have a purpose, you have questions you're asking, you're making inferences, and you haven't been able to get a word in edgewise, but you did have questions because, and I have a purpose and I have questions, you see, and I'm making inferences and I'm going in multiple directions. You see, my reasoning, and sometimes my reasoning, goes in a lot of different directions and needs to be come back to the center because I start thinking on multiple planes. So our reasoning is guiding our thinking. And what we all need to know is that these are present. We're using information, but is it accurate? Is it relevant? We're making inferences, but is it a reasonable inference? Is there another possibility here? Is it a logical inference? What are my concepts that are guiding my thinking? Take the concept of love. How do you think of love? I could ask anyone, what is your concept of love? And you might say, what do you mean by love? You mean intimate love? You mean parental love? You mean love as in friendship? I would say that's a good move because there's not just one kind of love, there are multiple types. But see, we begin to get into the concept of love. And then we can talk about the different types of love and what would be entailed in each one and what would be missing from each one. So we could take the concept of democracy. We could say, where have democracies ever existed in the world that have worked? And to what degree have they worked and to what degree have they not worked? Is there really is there something like a democracy, or is it multiple forms of democracy? You know, how do we think about democracy? You see there, so that's just getting into concepts. So concepts are guiding our thinking. We're working with huge assumption bases about ourselves, about others, about the world. Often we don't know how to tap into these. So critical thinking helps us find those assumptions. And so we have the elements, we have the standards, we have the traits. And before I close on this, I want to just point out that, you see, the human mind going to the center here naturally develops some intellectual skills. I've already said that. All of us sometimes, if not frequently, think critically. But the question is, how do you cultivate your critical capacities? Because all of us know that we're not perfect if it comes to the point. So this requires active cultivation of intellectual traits like the virtues that I was mentioning, ethical sensitivities, and many intellectual skills. But this is something that we cannot ignore. The mind is also naturally egocentric and sociocentric. And this just gives you a snapshot of the barriers to critical thinking as against rational thinking. So I think of egocentric and sociocentric thinking as twin evil sisters. I've never said it like that. You know, they're twin bad guys. And so now I've got the female and the male in there, so nobody can get upset. So the egocentric mind is fairly easy to get to grasp. One part of it is just sheer selfishness. We know people that are selfish. Of course, we're not selfish ourselves, but we can think of other people that are selfish. So selfishness is an easy concept to get. So humans are selfish. We're also frequently locked into our own logic. So it's my way or the highway. I mean, it may not have anything to do with me getting anything, but this is what I've always thought about it. You got to fit into this logic, even though it's flawed in certain ways. To me, it seems perfect. The parallels here for sociocentric thinking would be, instead of selfishness, as I said, I'm using the term groupishness, group selfishness. Many examples of that. More for my country, our country's best. Nationalism leads to selfishness, or groupishness, rather. You see, the two go together. And then the other parallel here is that the sociocentric thinking validates its group's way of thinking, whereas the egocentric thinking is validating my own. When I'm in a group, we're validating one another. So we're locked into group logics. But we don't want either one of these happening. What we want is the rational mind to be in control, where we're striving to consider the rights and needs of others while achieving our own goals. It doesn't mean we're not taking care of yourself. It doesn't mean you're not, wanting to be the best in your field. That's fine, as long as you're not stepping on other people to do it. So that the rational mind is always has always the ethical dimension there, ready to say, wait a minute, Linda, are you missing something here? Are you forgetting someone's point of view? Are you stereotyping this person? Are you dismissing them, etc.? And then the rational person is not locked into any logic. The rational person wants to know what is actually happening. That's all. What is really happening here? Remember, confidence in reason. So what we have to do if we're studying critical thinking is that we have to realize that it's not as easy as saying, well, just study the elements and study the standards and study the traits and do those. Now, what about the egocentric and sociocentric thinking? When I'm thinking egocentrically, I'll say I am being logical. I am applying logic. I'm being logical. You're the one that's being illogical. You're not listening to me. Whenever it's the other way around, you see. So you can learn all these tools and still misuse them, unless you get that you have the egocentric thinking and sociocentric thinking ready to hijack the rational self, something like that. So we have, again, the same parallelisms that I already mentioned, but they're just in a slightly different way here. So rational capacities are fair-minded and self-developing. Irrational propensities egocentric and sociocentric thinking. Remember, selfish, self-validating, groupish, group validating. But here's what this diagram adds. One of these is largely conscious. That's your rational thinking. But this thinking, egocentric thinking, always has an unconscious dimension, because you're always telling yourself you're right. Somehow, when people are, let's say, when people are torturing someone else, they do it under a justification, right? They're telling themselves it's just fine. And the brutality of what they're engaging in, they're hiding from themselves. And that's the unconscious side. But here is the other problem. But both of these, all of this thinking appears to be rational. So I don't want to end on a bad note. But in terms of the introduction to critical thinking, it's not a bad place to end this brief introduction, because if this is, to the degree that this is true, we really can see why humans have so many problems. Because everything that we do, we feel justified in. Even when it's wrong, even when part of us is saying, you shouldn't be doing that. But the other part is saying, yeah, but you're justified. You're justified. Self-deception is not learned by the human mind. It comes with the package. So we naturally self-deceive, and when we do, we engage in all kinds of defense mechanisms that we've known about for more than 100 years with the work of Freud and Anna Freud. So, rationalization, projection, sublimation, overgeneralization. There are so many. But in any case, we naturally engage in those. So if you're going to develop as a critical thinker, you're going to have to get command of your egocentric and sociocentric nature and realize that they're always there trying to tell you that you're right and you're good and you're perfect, when you really aren't those things. So now let me pause and see if you have a question.
Yeah, so thank you so much for sharing this introduction with us here. One of the main points I got from being introduced to your work is this concept or this intention of fair-minded critical thinking versus other forms of critical thinking, and I translated myself to, it's really about like finding out what is truth about things. It doesn't matter what I believe or what anybody else believes, like who I am or where I come from. And that might challenge a lot of my own perspectives, but it will also mean freedom, or it leads to more freedom. So that's kind of how I translate it. But then also, if and you might correct me if that's not correct, but from what I know, Socrates was also about pursuing truth, but it didn't end so well for him. So it can lead to a very lonely place, no? As you mentioned before, this intellectual standard of autonomy, no matter what others are thinking. And what I would love to hear a little bit also from you is that how can we learn this critical thinking? What's your approach to educate others to this way of thinking?
Well, that is a good lead into this. I was sharing these diagrams. I wanted to show everyone that when you join our community online, you will be able to go to this screen, which by the way has a tutorial and an overview of critical thinking, which is a little more expansive than the one I just gave for those interested. And we have 3 sections. We have a library. I was just in the library of publications for everyone. I was working in the miniature guide, the analytic thinking guide, and the thinker's guide to the human mind, and how to study and learn. We have 23 thinker's guides to critical thinking you can also purchase from our publisher, but we have half of each guide here. And so you want to spend some time there. We have the largest library on critical thinking online in the world. And we have an audio visual library where you can reach back in to see some of the work of our founder, Dr. Richard Paul, and I strongly recommend that you do that. These are focused on instruction, but if you're interested in critical thinking, it shouldn't matter that these are focused on instruction, because you see what we do in the classroom, we do for life. We're not, in other words, whatever applies to the classroom also applies to life after the classroom. And so you will want to spend some time there. And then in our Critical Thinking Academy, you can go to any of these primary titles. For example, I was talking about the barriers to critical thinking, and I was saying you've got to be aware of these. Here we introduce the barriers again, and you can watch some videos focused on this, and then you can do activities which will help you get command of these barriers in your own mind. We begin by asking you to just analyze a self-centered person that you know, not yourself, because we're not starting with the hardest part. So you click on this, and I'll make this a little smaller. So here's the activity. Think of a self-centered person you know. This may be someone who's fundamentally selfish or arrogant. Complete these statements. Describe the person's behavior. So you're writing their answer, you're typing it in, and based on the person's behavior, I would describe his or her thinking in the following ways. And looks like we have a little problem here. This person displays the following types of feelings, and they're motivated in the following ways. You see, so you can write out your answers, and you can print, share within the community, and save. And you can also just write, you can write in your own journal, just using our format. So this is a good way. To what extent are you egocentrically dominating? To what extent are you egocentrically submissive? And analyze your group membership. So it really, these activities really ask you to think about the thinking that you're not really aware of, or you're not wanting to face about yourself. So these are just some examples, and then you can go to any of the others. Just take the wheel of reason. That's focusing on the elements of reasoning. And here you can analyze the logic of a problem. You can analyze the logic of an article, the logic of a book. So the logic of a problem, you could do this many times. We basically explain how to do it, focusing on the elements. And then we give you an example of this, very brief. And then you write out your own answers to what is the problem, what is the question, what are the purposes, you see, and you can do this again many, many times. So then just finally in the community online, we have the Critical Thinking Cafe. You can connect with members. This is an open forum. We have discussion groups, we have study groups. We're doing a study group right now on the classics and also learning the foundations of critical thinking. All of these things are free once you're a member. We have a blog, and we have been offering 2 webinars a month, one by myself and one by my colleague, Dr. Gerald Nosich, who's our other senior fellow. We do one of these each month, and we also, so we have 2 a month. He does one and I do one, and then we're also going to add an open forum question and answer session per month. So any community members can ask us any questions, and it's a really growing dynamic process. And so I hope that you'll join us there. And let me say that there aren't simple ways to learn critical thinking. You can't just say, well, how about if I just take, that one diagram and, just study that. No, it won't work that way. You've got to talk about it. You've got to read about it. You've got to study it. You've got to apply it. And that's why we offer many learning opportunities. We have an online course. We have online courses that are also potentially for credit that we offer at the Foundation for Critical Thinking twice a year, in addition to the community online. We have a conference every summer. We're planning right now the 42nd Annual International Conference on Critical Thinking and Educational Reform. So we have a lot of opportunities at the Foundation. So join us. You can join the Critical Think community again at criticalthinkingcommunity.org. You can you can just see what we do more broadly at criticalthinking.org. So that's my advice.
I will add all the resources to the show notes of this episode so everybody can learn
Good.
more about critical thinking.
And there are some books I would also recommend that you purchase. I don't know how easy it is for you to get these over.
Yeah, absolutely. No problem. You give me
yeah.
the links or the names and I will add them.
I will do that.
Yeah, sure. So what I understand also is that, yeah, it requires some work to kind of integrate critical thinking into your thinking routine. Would you say that you graduated critical thinking, or is this a never-ending pursuit?
I'm not exactly clear about the question. Do I think that I'm...
If you graduated.
Graduate. No, never.
Critical thinking.
No, never. No, that's what I thought you were asking. So the way that I think about critical thinking is that you wouldn't, like, I don't say I don't say of myself that I'm a critical thinker. I don't say of anyone that they're a critical thinker. I say of them that they're thinking critically in this domain, or they think well within this domain. Because to say that someone's a critical thinker implies that they have reached the top. And you can't reach the top as a human. No one can. Because you've always got irrational or propensities. Everyone does. It's a question of figuring out what yours are doing within yourself and stopping, the thinking as much as you can. So, and you can't, and in the same way, I wouldn't say that anyone could ever again fully embody intellectual virtues. So you could say, she has a lot of intellectual empathy, but you wouldn't say she is a person of complete intellectual empathy, because you don't know that. You don't see her in every domain. How can you say that? So that's a very important question. And a lot of people misuse that. It's all by degree, and you never will reach your full capacity. So and let me just say this about the practice. Anyone who's an athlete should be able to relate to this. Or if you're a musician, you should be able to relate to this. If you've ever done anything well in your life, you should be able to relate to this. Doing anything well requires work. And the same is true for reasoning. If you want to reason well, it will require work. And that means facing your nonsense, facing your irrationalities. It means choosing your own path to the degree that any of us can in a pathological society, keeping yourself sane in a pathological world. And like you were talking about moving. So, sometimes we have to move to be sane. Sometimes we have to leave someone that we love to be sane. Sometimes we have to leave a job to be sane. But mostly people don't take the power that they have. They don't believe in their minds. They don't believe that they can achieve. So critical thinking requires that we do hard work, but it has great benefits. And those benefits are what we all need as humans. So if we think about, for example, tennis, if you want to learn how to play tennis, you probably wouldn't do it just by reading a book, though some have. Some rare few have learned to do it well. But mostly, that's not how you would learn to play tennis. Mostly, you would get a coach. And you would, right? You would study under someone who knew, and you would practice a lot. Well, that's a good metaphor for critical thinking, because it requires teachers, as far as I can tell. It requires people who know the theory to teach the theory. And then the people who are learning it have to be motivated to learn it. So, and they have to realize that every time they work on this subject, they're going to use the same fundamentals. So if you come to a conference on critical thinking that we hold, you're always going to be exposed again and again to the elements of reasoning, intellectual standards, intellectual virtues, and the barriers. And we're going to approach those in different ways, because if you take those out, you don't have critical thinking anymore. You can't build without that foundation. See, it's like saying, I want to play tennis and I want to go to clinics, but I'm sick and tired of having to use the ball and the net and the racket. I don't want to use those anymore. You see, so the foundation, you're always going to have those same foundations. The same is true with critical thinking. So people have to take those tools, pick them up and use them. And that's why we offer so many opportunities for doing that.
That's wonderful. As you just showed that image before, where it, from my perspective, it's really becoming conscious of our unconscious thinking habits. And through that, we are enabled to be more conscious about what we actually want to contribute to. Our behaviors, our actions, and everything what we have in life is a reflection in the end of our thinking, right? So
exactly.
No matter where you are, what you do, what's your intention, everybody will benefit from from investigating and learning, improving their own thinking, right? Because that's something which which is present anywhere with everything you do. You're thinking, your results are a reflection of your own thinking. So it seems something very worthwhile to.
Well, right. It's like once you begin to understand it, you realize that we've been missing the boat. You know, we've missed the most important thing in teaching and learning, which is command of your mind. And this, by the way, shows another diagram which helps kind of illuminate what you were just saying. So we see the world, we see reality, but we see it typically through lenses that make it so that we're not seeing it clearly and not seeing it accurately. So I talked about egocentric and sociocentric pathologies, and this really just illuminates that. Selfishness, groupishness, distortions, prejudices, biases, fallacies, all the defense mechanisms I talked about. But when you look at it here, you can see why we have so many problems, because but all of those lenses seem crystal clear to us, but they're leading us in the wrong direction. So we're not actually seeing reality. We're seeing something other than that.
So that also could be translated to, if you ask someone on the street, do you have a problem with your thinking? You'd probably get a weird stare, but it's basically a default situation, our thinking, right? It's where we start with a biased thinking. So everybody has a problem with their thinking until they look into it.
Exactly. That's why when we talk about prejudice and we talk about how to deal with, let's say, prejudice in the in the police, let's say in the US, if we're going to reform the police and we're not going to be, as violent, we're going to stop, killing people, innocent people, because we're overreacting, that sort of thing. Well, for that to be reformed, the police are going to have to understand what we've been talking about here. They're going to have to get commands of the thinking. They're going to have to say that every single person is prejudiced. So don't say you're not. We all are. We're prejudiced based on all kinds of variables. Your skin color, your gender, your height, your weight, your age, the way you dress, the way you wear your hair, the way you wear your clothing. I mean, what have I left out? Whether you have a disability, what kind of disability it is. We are prejudiced, every one of us. So that is something that, if that's true, to the degree that that's true, then you and I, for the rest of the day, should be asking ourselves, well, I wonder how that applies to me then. See, so because I've said that, but do I believe it? Like, for the rest of the day, am I going to be looking for my prejudices and my biases? No, because in the end, I'm intellectually arrogant like everyone else, and I don't think I have any. And therein lies the problem. So we find our biases and our prejudices mainly in context. So now I walk outside, I see a person of a certain skin color, boom, what did I infer? So then there is a direct, that leads me to my bias. Then I can say, okay, wait a minute, Linda, what were you basing that on? So then you see, so we all prejudge because we all come in with our assumption base, and our assumption base is often flawed. So this is why we have to realize that instead of thinking that our thinking is mainly fine, we should think our thinking is frequently flawed. You know, because that's more, it's a better beginning place. Notice I said frequently, not always. And what's important is not to say, you know, I'm a flawed thinker. That's not the point. The point is to find the flaws in my thinking.
That's probably a very helpful step, to not identify oneself with one's thinking anymore, but
Exactly.
become the observer of one's thinking. And if you're not tied to your own thoughts, if you don't identify yourself with your thinking, then it's far more easy to change them, because it doesn't mean you are flawed, just your thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So another way of saying that is I am not my thoughts. My thoughts can be changed. And it also, I think, is connected to self-esteem, because you are whole in yourself. You don't need to hold certain views to be whole. You need to hold views that make sense to hold. Like, for example, there are some beliefs that I have that I have based in ethical principles, and they seem to be principles that everyone should hold, like do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So that's just that's something that, and you know, don't basically don't do anything to harm other people if you can avoid it. You see, so there are a lot of ethical principles that we do say, but in the end, I'm going to still hold these. And yet that's different from holding any number of other beliefs that may be questionable. And here's another one. I'm always going to hold as my goal the intellectual virtues. So nothing that you or anyone can say to me is going to change that. You might add to my understanding, you may deepen my understanding, but I'm always going to need to think about intellectual empathy, intellectual humility, and all of the virtues. So you're not connected to your beliefs in that you're unwilling to question them, but you're not going to question everything. And so what I'm trying to do is say, I'm not going to be a relativist either. I'm not going to say there aren't any beliefs that are worth holding. Yes, I'm always going to adhere to intellectual standards, the clarity, accuracy, relevance, depth, breadth, and so forth. So you see, critical thinking is both easy and hard.
So it seems to me that instead of like having this personalized identity, it's more about grounding one's philosophical belief system, one's worldview on an ethical foundation, which is not tied to any identity in terms of age, gender, or capacities or anything. And so like it seems to me that actually enables to look at one's belief system from a perspective where you can investigate it, because it's not you, like it doesn't define you.
And another thing connected to this is the concept of egalitarianism, when we think about including everyone to the table of knowledge and to the table of life, if you will. So I think a lot of things that we're doing right now in human societies are really dividing us. They're not uniting us. You know, these terms like inclusion and diversity and all of these words that are popping up, I don't know that they're helping us achieve egalitarianism. And I think they are trying to do that. And it's a noble attempt in many cases. But we've got to think critically about that. And we've got to see, when we say, for example, inclusion, what do you mean by that? We're not going to include every idea that somebody has. In fact, we're going to reject a lot of ideas that people have. So we're going to include based on gender and skin color, but then when you do that, then you are also excluding people. You see, so it's not, so yes, we want to include, but then who do we exclude, and what do we do with them? And so these are complicated concepts. And in the end, what we want is a world, I mean, it sounds sort of, now it almost seems bizarre to say this, but when I was a child growing up, I thought that we were going to be able to achieve a world where we didn't even see color. I must have been very naive, that your skin color just wouldn't, you wouldn't even notice it. That was how I thought of it. But we've gone the other way. And so we're less inclusive, we're more divisive, we're less integrated, and yet we're all humans. We're all we have almost the same DNA, and we should be citizens of the world, all of us. And I mean, how many people have an ID that says citizen of the world? You don't get that. We don't have that in human society. We have you're a citizen of a country, right? And you can get kicked out of your country, and maybe some countries don't want you, but there's no citizen of the world kind of conception. So anyway, I'm going in different directions, but all of this is related to achieving fair-minded critical societies.
What I love about your framework is that belief that everybody is capable or has the capacity to critical thinking and fair-mindedness. To me, that changes or that impacts obviously how I see, how I interact with others quite a bit. And I know we are about to run out of time. Maybe as a last question, and with your introduction, you referred to this already a little bit. Would you say that our society is striving towards more critical thinking, towards fair-mindedness, or is that still something which is not really getting traction?
It's a hard question, because if you're a historian, which I'm not, but I have some reading in history, some sense of it. If you understand human history, you understand that we can progress within an era while also regressing within the same era on certain other things. So we'd have to say, I think the question would have to be, have we reached a point where we can say, in this, humans think critically, and they're only going to ever think, it's only going to get better. I don't know that we can say that, but there are certain signs on both sides that you could mark. For example, the concept of democracy, however flawed it ends up being, has seemed to be the most viable political system. And so we in our last few hundred years, we've achieved that to some degree. And there's an understanding among enlightened people that democracy seems to be the best answer over monarchy and dictatorship and other ways of thinking about the political structure. But then we also embrace, without question, mainly we embrace capitalism, which has in its current unbridled form many ugly underbellies that affect the people. Again, capitalism has largely trampled upon the people because we haven't figured out how to make it equitable for the people. so that we have, let's say, small businesses allowed. You remember when there was like monopolies weren't allowed? What a joke, right? I mean, it's just that died decades ago, that concept. So I'm saying that capitalism in itself is, in its current form, in many ways is highly problematic, but we're not allowed to talk about that in human societies, and not in this country, and not in many countries. And by that, I mean, if you talk about it, even in school, even in colleges, even in business schools, they will not like the conversation, because you're questioning what drives their whole being. And then there are all kinds of other implications within other fields that get connected to the money, ugly money side of this, including the whole mental health profession, which gets involved, and the pharmaceuticals that have to make as much money as they can on the people. I mean, just it goes on and on. So you see, when people say, you know, things are better, I'd say, well, what do you mean? In this way, yes. In this way, no. There's more understanding than there's ever been in human societies, as far as I can tell, in terms of animal rights. But we're still barely, you know, we're hardly there, you know, we're hardly there, but we're in the right direction. We're starting to get some colleges with, you know, this emphasis, the ethical dimension. That's late, but it's coming. And of course, in terms of the people, there is a lot of movement toward this, right? Because lots of people are eating much more sustainably. So there have always been enlightened people in human societies, and there have always been unenlightened people. It's a matter of degree. And then you could take, let's say, the right for women to work in you know, outside of the home. Well, that's a right that we've had in so-called civilized societies for, or advanced, let's say, advanced societies for, you know, decades now, a few decades now. But then what's the underbelly of that? Well, or is there one? Well, one is there's been a kind of, unfortunately, a backlash that's meant that, yes, more women are working, but then there also seems to be more, let's say, emphasis on things like sexual harassment now. So now I'm bringing in the sexual dimension. So now we're in a world where if you and I were in the room together, Simon, I couldn't just reach over and touch your arm. And you certainly couldn't reach over and touch mine. Right? Oh, Linda, I was thinking, oh, no, don't get near me. So we've created a world where we can't even touch each other in the US. So teachers can't hug the students. Teachers at the college professors cannot even have any kind of intimate relationship with any of their, not only any of their students, but any students, any people that might be their students. Anybody that's anywhere on the university at the, you know, that's a student. So you see, that is not to me, that is not a winning situation, because yes, there are always going to be people who abuse other people, who exploit other people, and it goes both ways. Professors do it to students, students do it to professors. What about that? See, it's more complicated than we want to make it. And so I'm saying that's there, and there are other things related to this I think are problematic. There's the political correctness now in universities, where you can't, you know, freedom of speech is like, you know, we can't even, don't try to have freedom of speech, because that's just going to upset the apple cart. Just another one, sexuality. How do we think about sexuality in human cultures? When was the last time you even had a conversation about it with anyone other than your intimate, you know, partner? When was the last time anybody talked about sexuality? Well, we don't talk about it because we're uncomfortable about it, and we don't talk about that. So back in the 60s and 70s, they were talking about it. There was a free love movement, and there was the free sex movement. Maybe that wasn't the greatest idea, but it was, you know, and also there was a lot of literature coming out of that, where people were exploring, you know, the concept of open marriage and what would that look like and how could that be done. And again, I'm not sure how you do that. I'm just saying that even to discuss it frightens people. And so if I'm bringing up things right now that are making people feel uncomfortable, to the degree that they're uncomfortable, we're lacking critical thinking, because that means we can't even talk about these things without people just cringing. So are things getting better? In many ways, in some ways, yes. And then of course, I need not even mention the sustainability issues, which, you know, we're late. We're not going to make this, I don't think. We're not going to save the human species from disaster because we're not thinking critically enough. We're not fast enough. We're cutting down too many trees when we know we shouldn't be doing that. And I can see it right around me. I mean, I can see the destruction. I can see people here who have no value to a tree, just gets in the way here. So why would you need a tree? You know, you just get rid of it. So, and we don't really have the technological solutions to sustain the earth, to reduce our pollutants enough. We do and we don't. You know, we don't have the funding. We may have the technology, but we can't see if it really would work because we don't have the funding. And I'm speaking in general terms. There are exceptions to these things, but you get the point. So I'm saying that in many ways we've improved, but you think about, if you think about like the example that I brought up about Afghanistan, what does that say of us as critical thinkers? I mean, setting aside the ethical dimension, just the logistical nightmare that became, it was a disaster. It just was an F, because that means we couldn't think just even in the most fundamental ways, we couldn't think critically. Our military, you know, supposedly the best in the world or one of the best, and we can't even think critically about this basic, how do you protect people when you're leaving a country? Now that seems to me to be a lot easier than they made it out to be. See what I mean? So I'm saying that if we fail at very basic critical thinking in these very significant situations, which we've been through before, and if we're trying for history not to repeat itself, we are learning from that, but maybe we're not learning from that. And maybe there's a lot of intellectual arrogance, and maybe that's what will come out of this. So you see, and then there are many positive things as well. So I don't know how to answer that. Are things getting better? Or are they getting worse? For people more violent, are people less violent now than they were 1,000 years ago? You know, there's evidence to say that on average, maybe we are less violent. And I think all that really means is that in a lot of countries, we feel pretty safe that another country's not going to just come over and take us over and take, you know, just steal all the women and rape them and make them their wives. And see what I mean? But that's done in some countries. So it's
a
it's hard to
multi-dimensional question and answers.
Yeah.
I see. Well, let's hope that this conversation inspires many, many people out there to learn critical thinking so that the future looks even brighter than it might today.
Well, thank you for including critical thinking in your interviews. I've enjoyed it. And again, I hope that everyone will join us at criticalthinkingcommunity.org.
Yeah, I can just confirm from my side, being introduced to thinking and then critical thinking, it has been a blessing to me. So I can truly recommend everybody who feels inspired to this resonates with for their own, the sake of your own empowerment, basically. Check it out. Yeah, it's absolutely worthwhile and truly helpful. So yeah, thank you for the conversation. It was a true honor and pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Simon, for having me. Take care.
Yeah, so goodbye, everybody. Thank you for listening and see you next time.